The alien shuttle was a sleek, humming masterpiece of engineering. Polished silver curves, smooth edges, and not a single exposed bolt or seam. Sitting awkwardly in the center seat, Lieutenant Jackson Reid stared out the window at the sprawling training complex ahead. It floated above the surface of a turquoise gas giant, tethered by an intricate lattice of energy bridges and docking arrays. Alien starships buzzed around like metallic hornets, their movements precise and elegant. Jackson scratched the back of his neck, his fingers catching on the stiff collar of his borrowed uniform. The thing itched like crazy, but the alien quartermaster who had handed it to him didn't seem interested in tailoring it for human comfort. He shifted uncomfortably, pulling at the tight fabric. "Humans," muttered a voice behind him, thick with disdain. "So fragile." Jackson turned his head slightly to glance at the speaker, a towering insectoid alien with glistening emerald exoskeleton and mandibles that clicked every time it breathed. Its name, or at least the closest approximation Jackson could manage, was rewrote. He was one of the senior trainees, and his opinion of humans was no secret. "Not fragile," Jackson said with a lazy grin. "We just value comfort more than you do. You should try a nice recliner sometime. Game changer." Rewrote hissed something under his breath in his native language, likely a string of insults. Jackson leaned back, unfazed. He'd been getting looks and whispers since the moment he stepped off Earth. Humans were the newcomers in galactic politics, and most species didn't see the point of including them in anything important, especially not the elite training programs of the Concord Defense Fleet. Unfortunately for the Concord, a recently signed treaty required them to recruit a handful of humans for integration. Jackson suspected the ink on the treaty wasn't even dry before they found a loophole, shoving him into the first training group they could find to tick a box and move on. The shuttle docked with a soft hum, and the recruits filed out in precise order. Jackson was the last to disembark, his boots clunking noisily against the pristine floor of the hangar. He caught several alien officers giving him side-eye, their expressions a mix of curiosity and annoyance. "Lieutenant Jackson Reid, reporting for training," he said, snapping off a salute to the officer in charge. The gesture felt absurdly formal compared to the Concord's usual stiff nods, but Jackson had a hunch it would annoy them. The officer, a sleek avian alien with opalescent feathers, looked him over with thinly veiled disapproval. "Human," it said, the word dripping with skepticism. "You are here solely because of the treaty. I do not expect you to last the week." Jackson smirked. "Bet I make it too." That earned him a sharp glare, but the officer didn't respond. Instead, it gestured for him to follow. "You will find that Concord training is unlike anything you have experienced on your primitive world. If you do not follow the instructions precisely, you will fail. Quickly." "Good to know," Jackson replied, though he had no intention of following their instructions. Manuals were for people who lacked imagination. The first day was a disaster, at least from the aliens' perspective. During the introductory weapons training, Jackson ignored the stack of glowing manuals provided and began tinkering with the energy rifle in front of him. By the time the instructor noticed, he'd dismantled the rifle's cooling system and adjusted the capacitor for a faster recharge rate. "You are forbidden to modify Concord equipment," barked the instructor, a bulbous amphibian with pulsating skin. Jackson held up the modified rifle, grinning. "Relax, I put it back together. Better, actually. Try it." The instructor snatched the rifle, muttering angrily, and fired it at the nearest target. A perfectly calibrated energy blast disintegrated the bullseye, followed immediately by the next two targets in the sequence. The room fell silent. "See," Jackson said, folding his arms. "You have that thing throttled. Runs much smoother now." The instructor's bulbous eyes narrowed, but they couldn't argue with the results. The next challenge was a piloting simulation. Most trainees spent hours poring over the Concord's complex flight manuals, but Jackson skipped straight to the cockpit. Concord starships operated on an entirely different logic system than anything he'd encountered, but instead of being intimidated, he experimented. Trial, error, adjustment. It was second nature to him. By the time the others were cautiously starting their engines, Jackson had already completed a flawless docking maneuver and was attempting barrel rolls. The simulation control room was in chaos. "He bypassed the entire startup sequence," one technician hissed. "That is not how the system is designed to function." "It works, doesn't it?" muttered another, reluctantly impressed. At the end of the day, Jackson found himself alone in the barracks, surrounded by alien recruits who avoided him like the plague. He didn't mind. He was used to being underestimated. As he tinkered with a small alien device he'd borrowed from the weapons locker, Jackson smiled to himself. The Concord didn't know it yet, but they were about to get a crash course in human ingenuity. "Who needs instructions?" he muttered, holding up the now improved device as it hummed to life. The training grounds were an expanse of high-tech marvels. Holographic targets floated mid-air, glowing grids marked advanced combat zones, and sleek simulators lined the perimeter. To the Concord recruits, this was the epitome of order and precision. To Jackson Reid, it was a playground. "Today we begin with energy weapon drills," the avian instructor announced, its melodic voice carrying authority. "Precision and adherence to protocol are key. Do not deviate." The recruits, a mix of reptilian, insectoid, and amphibian aliens, fell into neat rows, each retrieving their assigned weapon. Jackson meandered to the back, eyeing the rack of energy rifles with mild curiosity. "Lieutenant Reid," the instructor called sharply, narrowing its crystalline eyes. "You will follow the procedures outlined in your manual, or do humans not understand instruction?" Jackson smirked, pulling a rifle from the rack. "Oh, we understand it just fine. We just like to find shorter routes." Ignoring the glowing manual projected from the rifle's interface, he flipped the weapon over, popping open the casing. Alien heads turned, antennae twitched, and a reptilian recruit hissed in disbelief. "What are you doing, human?" the instructor demanded, striding toward him. "Optimizing," Jackson replied, pulling a tool from his pocket. "You've got a heat sink here that's half the size it needs to be. No wonder these things overheat in sustained fire." "That design has been perfected over centuries," the instructor snapped. Jackson shrugged. "Centuries, huh? Guess you've never met an impatient human." He clicked the casing back into place and raised the rifle, aiming at the nearest target. A single shot disintegrated not only the bullseye, but the entire target frame. The silence was deafening. Even the instructor seemed at a loss for words. Next was piloting. The simulation pods were sleek and intimidating, their interiors bristling with alien controls and displays. Jackson slid into his assigned pod, his fingers brushing over the unfamiliar layout. "Do not deviate from the startup sequence," the avian instructor warned. "The process is delicate and exact." "Got it," Jackson replied, promptly ignoring the warning. The startup sequence was a series of glowing glyphs that seemed to take forever. Jackson bypassed them entirely, rerouting power directly to the main thrusters. The simulator roared to life, its holographic display projecting a dense asteroid field. Jackson grinned, gripping the controls. While the other recruits cautiously navigated the simulation, Jackson pushed the throttle to max. The holographic starship weaved through the asteroid field with reckless precision, narrowly avoiding collisions. When a simulated pirate ambush appeared, Jackson's instincts took over. Instead of engaging the enemies head-on, he used the asteroids as cover, ambushing the pirates with unorthodox maneuvers. The control room above the simulators was chaos. Technicians shouted over one another, their displays flashing with warnings. "He's bypassed half the controls. He's using the environment in ways the simulation isn't designed for. Look at his score." When the simulation ended, Jackson's starship had obliterated the ambush and docked at the final waypoint in record time. He climbed out of the pod, grinning at the stunned faces around him. "What? You said to finish the mission," he said. The aliens didn't know what to make of Jackson. His methods were unorthodox. His disregard for protocol was borderline insubordinate. And yet, he was succeeding. By the end of the day, whispers circulated through the training grounds. The human broke the weapons manual, and it worked. "Did you see his score in the piloting sim? No one's ever done that before." He's reckless, but effective. Even the instructors began to begrudgingly acknowledge him. During an advanced combat drill, Jackson modified the squad's communication systems to create a redundant channel, allowing them to coordinate seamlessly when the primary network failed. The instructor's only response was a curt nod of approval. As days turned into weeks, Jackson's trial-and-error approach began to influence the recruits around him. The rigid adherence to protocol that defined Concord training started to loosen. Recruits began experimenting with their weapons, tweaking their equipment, and even challenging the simulators in ways they never had before. Some instructors resisted the change, but others were intrigued. One amphibian officer even approached Jackson privately, asking for his input on a malfunctioning piece of equipment. "Why are you asking me?" Jackson asked, raising an eyebrow. "Thought you guys didn't need advice from primitives." The officer hesitated before replying. "You see things differently." Jackson smirked. That's one way to put it. The real turning point came during a live training mission aboard a Concord battlecruiser. As the recruits conducted a simulated defense against a pirate raid, a critical system malfunction threatened to derail the entire exercise. Jackson spotted the issue instantly, a miscalibrated power relay, and jumped into action. Ignoring the panicked protests of his team, he bypassed the relay entirely, rerouting power to the critical systems. The ship stabilized, and the exercise continued flawlessly. When the dust settled, the senior officer overseeing the mission approached Jackson, their expression unreadable. "You're reckless, human," they said, "but without you, this mission would have failed." Jackson grinned, wiping grease off his hands. "Reckless? Nah, just efficient." Jackson Reid had become an anomaly in the Concord training program. His name was whispered among recruits, both in awe and disbelief. Humans were supposed to be primitive, yet Jackson outperformed the galaxy's best and brightest, with nothing more than gut instincts and a reckless disregard for the rules. The next phase of training focused on advanced weapon systems. Recruits were tasked with operating and troubleshooting a Concord battlecruiser's targeting array, a complex system that required absolute precision. Most recruits followed the manual step by step, laboring to understand the intricate alien technology. Jackson, of course, did not. Instead, he dismantled the array's interface panel, exposing its delicate circuitry. Alien recruits gawked as he muttered to himself, splicing wires and recalibrating components with a confidence that bordered on insanity. "Reid!" barked the instructor, an insectoid with iridescent wings. "What do you think you're doing?" "Fixing your aim," Jackson replied, not looking up. He reassembled the panel, snapped it back into place, and stepped back. "Go ahead. Try it now." The instructor glared but complied, activating the targeting system. A holographic simulation lit up, projecting a fleet of enemy ships. With Jackson's modifications, the system locked onto every target with unprecedented speed and accuracy. The room fell silent. "This is impossible," the instructor muttered. Jackson folded his arms. "Not impossible, just human." Jackson's unorthodox methods began to draw followers. Recruits who once ridiculed him now sought his advice, eager to learn his approach to problem-solving. Jackson didn't just share his methods, he challenged them to think for themselves. During a live combat drill, Jackson's squad was tasked with defending a simulated outpost against a surprise attack. While other squads adhered strictly to the pre-planned strategies, Jackson improvised. He split his team into smaller units, using decoy beacons and ambush tactics to outmaneuver the attackers. The result? A flawless defense and a new record for the drill. His squadmates were exhilarated. "How did you come up with that plan so fast?" one alien asked. "Simple," Jackson replied, grinning. "I didn't read the plan." Not everyone was impressed by Jackson's success. Some recruits viewed his methods as reckless and disrespectful to centuries of Concord tradition. One such recruit, a hulking reptilian named Vorath, confronted him during a training break. "You think you're better than us, human?" Vorath snarled, his tail lashing. Jackson leaned casually against a console, unfazed. "Not better, just different." Vorath hissed, stepping closer. "Your arrogance will get us all killed one day." Jackson's grin faded, his voice dropping to a serious tone. Arrogance is ignoring a problem because you think the manual already solved it. I'm here to make sure we don't die because someone was too proud to try something new." The tension lingered, but even Vorath couldn't deny the truth in Jackson's words. Jackson's impact on the training program was undeniable. Instructors began incorporating elements of his trial-and-error approach into their lessons, encouraging recruits to experiment and adapt. The once rigid and methodical Concord training program started to evolve, becoming more dynamic and flexible. During a high-stakes simulation involving multiple starships, Jackson introduced a revolutionary idea: syncing the ship's targeting systems to share data in real time. The result was a seamless, coordinated assault that overwhelmed the simulated enemy fleet. When the simulation ended, the lead instructor addressed Jackson directly. "Your methods are unconventional," they admitted, "but they may have merit." "Merit, huh?" Jackson said with a smirk. "I'll take it." The Concord announced a test flight for a prototype warship, a cutting-edge vessel designed to operate in high-risk combat zones. Only the most elite pilots were considered for the mission, and to everyone's shock, Jackson was chosen. As he prepared for the flight, an avian instructor approached him. "Do not squander this opportunity, human. This is a privilege." Jackson glanced at the sleek experimental ship waiting in the hangar. "Privilege? Nah, this is what I do." The test flight began smoothly, with Jackson marveling at the ship's advanced systems. But halfway through, a critical malfunction occurred. The propulsion system destabilized, threatening to tear the ship apart. While the Concord technicians panicked, Jackson took control. Ignoring the emergency protocols, he rerouted power manually, stabilizing the ship's core and completing the test flight. When he landed, the hangar erupted in cheers. As Jackson disembarked from the prototype warship, the senior Concord officer approached him, their expression unreadable. "You have proven yourself, Lieutenant Reid, but this is only the beginning." Jackson smirked, wiping grease from his hands. "Good. I like beginnings." In the distance, another Concord officer activated a holographic display, showing the outline of a human-shaped figure. "Perhaps it is time to reconsider humanity's role in the galaxy." Jackson Reid's high-risk test flight wasn't just a success, it was a wake-up call. His ability to stabilize the prototype warship under extreme conditions forced even the most skeptical Concord officers to acknowledge humanity's value. Discussions began at the highest levels of the Concord about expanding human involvement in their forces, but not everyone was ready to embrace the change. "You've disrupted everything," Rilktar hissed, his mandibles clicking in agitation. The towering insectoid loomed over Jackson in the training grounds, his iridescent exoskeleton gleaming under the artificial sunlight. "The Concord's methods are flawless. Your recklessness will undo centuries of order." Jackson leaned back against a console, arms crossed. "If your methods were so flawless, you wouldn't need me to fix your ships, would you?" Rilktar's wings twitched angrily, but he didn't respond. Jackson shrugged, pushing off the console. "Face it, your order is just another way of saying you're afraid of change." The next major event in the program was a full-scale battle simulation. The recruits were divided into teams and tasked with defending a Concord starbase from an overwhelming simulated enemy force. It was meant to test their ability to follow orders and execute strategies with precision. Jackson, of course, had other ideas. During the simulation briefing, he raised his hand. "Why are we waiting for them to come to us?" The instructor blinked, clearly annoyed. "The objective is to defend the starbase, Lieutenant Reid. That requires holding your position." "Or," Jackson countered, "we take the fight to them and catch them off guard." The room erupted in murmurs. The instructor glared at Jackson but didn't stop him. "Very well, but if your team fails, the fault will be entirely yours." Jackson grinned. "Wouldn't have it any other way." Jackson's team executed his unorthodox strategy flawlessly. Instead of fortifying the starbase, they launched a preemptive strike, using decoy ships to draw the enemy into an ambush. Jackson himself piloted one of the lead vessels, weaving through enemy fire with daring maneuvers that left the simulated fleet in disarray. By the end of the simulation, his team had not only defended the starbase, but completely neutralized the enemy force, a feat no other team had accomplished. In the observation deck, the senior officers watched in stunned silence. "He's not just thinking outside the box," one murmured. "He's building a new box." After the simulation, Jackson found himself summoned to the senior officer's quarters. The avian officer who had once dismissed him now regarded him with a mix of respect and irritation. "Lieutenant Reid," the officer began, "your methods are unorthodox, reckless even, but they work." "Is that your way of saying thank you?" Jackson asked with a smirk. The officer's feathers ruffled slightly, but they didn't deny it. "The Concord has thrived on order and tradition for centuries. Change does not come easily to us, but you have proven that humanity's adaptability may have a place here." Jackson gave a mock salute. "Glad to hear it." The next day, the training facility was thrown into chaos. An unknown enemy force, a rogue faction unaffiliated with the Concord, launched a surprise attack. The trainees were immediately called to action, their training put to the ultimate test. Jackson was in the hangar when the alarms blared. He sprinted toward the nearest battlecruiser, shouting for his team to follow. "This isn't a simulation," one recruit shouted, their voice panicked. "Exactly," Jackson replied, climbing into the pilot's seat. "Which means we can't afford to screw it up. Let's move." Jackson's squadron launched into the chaos, facing enemy ships that outnumbered them 3-1. While other teams struggled to adapt to the unpredictability of live combat, Jackson's instincts kicked in. He directed his squadron with rapid, unconventional orders, using tactics he'd developed through trial and error. "Take the lead ships out first," he barked over the comms. "Their formation falls apart if they lose the front line." "But that's not the standard protocol," protested one recruit. "Forget protocol, just trust me." His squadron followed his lead, dismantling the enemy formation piece by piece. By the time Concord reinforcements arrived, the battle was already won. As the last enemy ship was destroyed, Jackson's squadron returned to the training facility. The recruits were met with cheers and applause, but Jackson's focus remained on the senior officers watching from the observation deck. "You wanted proof humans belong here?" he said over the comms, his voice calm but firm. "There it is." The senior officer's expression remained unreadable, but a faint nod of approval was enough. Jackson climbed out of the cockpit, his team gathering around him. For the first time, the Concord recruits didn't look at him with skepticism or disdain. They looked at him with respect. The training facility was a flurry of activity as the recruits and officers processed the events of the unexpected attack. Debriefings were held, repairs were underway, and the Concord's leadership convened to discuss the implications of what had just transpired. Jackson Reid sat in the corner of the hangar, his squad huddled around him. For once, the alien recruits were eager to listen to him. "That was incredible," said Zorak, a reptilian recruit whose scales still glistened with sweat from the battle. "How did you know their formation would fall apart?" Jackson smirked, adjusting the makeshift brace he'd thrown over his injured arm. "It's not about knowing. It's about reading the situation. Predict what they'll do and hit them where it hurts." The recruits exchanged glances, a new understanding dawning on them. They weren't just learning Concord tactics anymore. They were learning how to think like humans. Meanwhile, in the senior officers' chamber, the Concord Council reviewed the battle footage. The holographic display showed Jackson's squadron dismantling the enemy fleet with precision and ingenuity. His commands, though unorthodox, had turned the tide of the battle. "This cannot be ignored," said High Commander Soria, the avian officer who had doubted Jackson from the start. "The human has demonstrated value that exceeds expectations." Another officer, an insectoid with shimmering wings, clicked its mandibles in agreement. Perhaps the treaty was not a mistake after all. Humanity's improvisation has proven effective. Soria turned to the assembled officers. "It is time we reconsider humanity's role in the Concord Defense Fleet. Their methods may be unconventional, but their results speak for themselves." The next day, Jackson was summoned to the senior officers' quarters. He expected another lecture, but instead, he was met with something entirely unexpected. "Lieutenant Reid," High Commander Soria began, her voice measured, Your actions have changed the way we view humanity. Your methods, while disruptive, have proven invaluable. We are expanding the recruitment program to include more humans." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "More humans, huh? Guess we're not so primitive after all." Soria ignored the jab. "In addition, we would like you to assist in redesigning our training program. Your approach to problem-solving has revealed flaws in our systems. It is time we adapt." Jackson couldn't help but grin. "You're asking me to teach your people how to think like humans?" "Precisely," Soria said with a slight incline of her head. Weeks later, the first wave of new human recruits arrived at the training facility. They stepped off the transport ships with wide eyes, taking in the advanced technology and towering aliens around them. Jackson stood at the edge of the hangar, watching with a mix of pride and amusement. A young recruit approached him, her expression a mixture of awe and nerves. "Are you Lieutenant Reid?" she asked. "Depends," Jackson replied. "You here to tell me I'm reckless, or to ask how to break the rules?" The recruit hesitated, then grinned. "Maybe both." Jackson laughed, clapping her on the shoulder. "You'll do fine. Just remember, instructions are guidelines, not laws." The Concord's training program underwent a transformation. No longer rigid and inflexible, it became a dynamic system that encouraged creativity and adaptability. Jackson's influence spread far beyond the facility, shaping a new era of galactic defense strategy. Alien recruits began adopting human tactics, learning to embrace risk and think outside the box. Meanwhile, humanity's presence in the Concord fleet grew, their ingenuity and resilience becoming a cornerstone of the alliance. Years later, Jackson stood on the bridge of a Concord flagship, his uniform now adorned with the insignia of a senior officer. The galaxy had changed, and so had he. The once dismissed human had become a legend, a symbol of what humanity could bring to the stars. As the ship prepared for its next mission, Jackson glanced at the glowing console in front of him. The interface was sleek and advanced, a blend of Concord and human engineering. "Who needs instructions?" he muttered, a grin spreading across his face. And with that, the flagship jumped into hyperspace, leading the way into a future shaped by human ingenuity.